Hey there, everyone, and welcome to a special Ask Me Anything episode of Stronger with Time. I'm your host, Tony Battaji. Over the last several weeks, many of you have had questions that have related to each of the podcasts that we've released. We've done our best to collate these questions and answer them in the order that they've come in. If you find this useful, please think about asking more questions on the future episodes that will be released over the next few weeks. Without further delay, please enjoy this Ask Me Anything episode.
Tony, before we dive in, did you have any opening statements or anything that you wanted to cover first?
I've been overwhelmed with how many of you have reached out with questions, but also with positive statements of how this information has affected you. And I've also worked out how many individuals in their 70s, 80s, and 90s can access YouTube and ask away. Now, in line with that, some of the questions were medically oriented, and I must confess, although I have a doctorate before my name, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm going to stay away from the medical-based questions. Secondly, some of the questions were really regarding Maria's work with exercise in specific health situations. She has offered to answer questions, and she has been doing so. So can I encourage you all, if you had a specific question that I don't cover, send her an email and she will get back to you. There's been two related questions that have come in across both platforms. So I'm just going to quickly cover that before we get into the question and answer. And the first has to do with the comment that usually comes in capitals, and it says, study women and hurry. And we get that across the different platforms that we're on, and they basically say the same thing. And my answer is absolutely. We need more studies across the females in the lifespan. But just as an aside, out of all of the funding that goes into health research, 80% is non-sex specific. So it goes males and females together. Of the 20% that is sex specific, 14% is spent on women and 6% is spent on men. So we actually have a tilted in favor of female research. That's it. Take it for what it is, but that's what the current data is from the health budget reporting. Secondly, there is this idea that we don't have any information on weight training in particular and females. And that is also not true. So studies on resistance training in females really first started to pop up around 1973. And we've got data on weight training and body composition and some fabulous work by Jack Wilmore, 1975. And then the really comprehensive studies by William Kramer and his team in the 1990s. Yesterday, I looked at a meta-analysis that included 790 studies on postmenopausal females doing resistance training. So this idea that we don't have research, it's not true. I don't know where it comes from, but perhaps we should be directing our attention to what do we know and what remains unanswered. And I think that might be more helpful. Now, the second thing I wanted to comment is based on information that I'm also sent every day, and it's to comment on other people's work. And I don't like to do that, and I don't like to do names, but I can certainly respond to the idea. And I just want you to all use logic for one moment. I am a PhD-trained sports scientist, exercise scientist, who has also coached in strength training in particular for 30 years. I don't go to my friends who are orthopedic surgeons and into the surgery and say, just take a little bit more off that meniscus there on the side. That's probably the best thing you can do for that knee is just take a bit off the meniscus, just a little bit more on the left. And I don't go to my friends who are environmental hydration experts and say, the worst thing you can do is add sodium to that drink. That's the worst thing. If you're a female, no sodium in that drink. And if you are a physician, I don't go in and just say, take 3 Advil, and if the pain persists, book another appointment with me. But this is what we see in the health space, is where there's confusion and money to be made. We see experts in their field cross the lane and start telling females that the best thing they can do to lose body fat is to lift heavy and to do sprint training. That's our job as coaches, to design an individualized progressive program that has all of the understanding of coaching, but also the science that underpins that. Now, when we look at the resistance training literature on visceral fat, belly fat reduction, maximal strength training is not highly supported. Other forms of resistance training are, and there's no difference in different intensity domains and visceral fat. It's primarily controlled by diet. So that's just stepping outside of the lane. And also when environmental experts in hydration start commenting that you should never exercise before breakfast if you are female, well, that ignores the wealth of literature that we have in humans that especially have looked at diabetes, the metabolic and adaptational response, and the muscular response to resistance training. So stay in the lane. And then when you see medical professionals doing chin-ups with a weighted vest on, but needing to use a band for assistance, I don't think I need to comment on that. That's not great advice. So let's use our logic. If it's not your area of training, don't comment. Leave it to those people to do it.
I actually had a conversation with someone today who was speaking to that vein specifically of, well, this person has a PhD next to their name. So I thought that I was getting good advice, but again, stepping outside of that lane and giving advice on a topic or an area where they're actually not an expert in, or that is not where they got their PhD.
The thing is, there's so much science. You cannot possibly be an expert in that field. And if you are an expert in a specific field, whether it's hydration, environmental science, medicine, orthopedic surgery, you cannot be expected to understand 50 years of resistance training literature. And it takes a degree of humility to say, I like it. I like lifting weights. This worked for me. That's wonderful. But still leave it to the experts who are in that area, who work in that field every day, who know the ins and the outs of the science, to give the comments, because all it's doing is confusing. It's confusing individuals say, well, I don't know what I should be doing. And that's a bad place we find ourselves because, as we've mentioned over and over, coaches and sports scientists are not confused about what works. Let's rely on those who've got the expertise in that area to be telling us, should you lift heavy? Sure, you can, but you don't have to. And we understand the science of what's going in at different rep ranges for females across the lifespan.
And I think that's a great point, and something that this podcast has been able to deliver quite well is allowing those that are experts, that are doing decades and decades of research in a very specific area to have a voice, because most of the time they're in the research. They're not on social media. It's been a gift to have that bridge in your skill set of being able to bridge the science and the practical application.
My job, I see it, is to bring a voice to those people who would never hear their voice, and then try as a coach and say, well, what does this mean in the gym and while you're doing your aerobic exercise? And of course, there are subtle disagreements amongst experts on how things should be done and organized and intensities. But these are minor things. They shouldn't distract us from the important point of we need both modes of exercise across multiple rep ranges, across multiple intensities aerobically, based on your preference and your enjoyment of exercise and potentially what's a weakness in your history of training. That's the fun part of individualizing, but they are not sex specific and they are not time of life specific. And when you hear advice contrary, because you are a female, you need to do this, then you should run for 30 minutes in the opposite direction, because then you get your cardio in as well, plus some bone loading. It's great news.
Any final things that we need to touch on before we dive into the questions? We're going to break them down per podcast.
Yeah, I think we start with Paul and metabolic training.
Correct. Mitochondria and metabolic health with Professor Paul Lawson. First question. On this podcast, the topic of muscle development was not in the focus, and that is totally reasonable. Yet I'd like to ask you whether it would be a good long-term strategy to build up mitochondrial health and efficiency during about half a year as it was presented in this podcast, and then put more time and effort to building muscle if hypertrophy is the main goal. Can it be realistic that so far in my muscle building history and journey, the lack of zone 2 work has been a majority limiting factor, if not the main bottleneck?
Great question. And the short answer is no. You actually don't need zone 2 or moderate intensity exercise to promote muscle mass, muscle hypertrophy. So you don't need to think, well, I haven't done a lot of it, so is that the cause of the issue? The short answer is no, don't worry about it. The longer, more detailed, nuanced answer is there's debate amongst mitochondrial experts as to how much of that moderate intensity exercise contributes to capillaries being developed in muscle, greater blood flow, therefore greater ability to do work. There is debate. There is some evidence on legs where one leg does cycling and the other leg does not, but both legs do the same weight training. Brilliant research design to show that those that did the cardio, the moderate intensity steady state, and weights had a greater hypertrophy effect. Now, this is a small study. It's a recent study. It's a proof of concept that there might be something there. But generally speaking, most mitochondrial experts are not really overwhelmingly convinced that you need this moderate intensity mitochondrial development to enhance hypertrophy. So as it stands, you don't need to worry. I am of the belief that they're not going to counteract. So let's make sure we do both in the week. But if you haven't been doing it, I wouldn't worry about it. Now, one final point on this is a lot of people will be concerned that they interfere. And if you do one, and then if you do the other, like you've suggested, if I do one for 6 months and do the other, you detrain. And I think this relates to another question that, can you do one and then stop it and do something else? I'll let Kat read the next question because that particularly answers the detraining effect.
The next one for this particular podcast is in relation to lactate threshold. Mm-hmm. So the question was, it would be interesting to see an episode on how lactate threshold is gaining more importance over heart rate and power for training.
Until we have really user-friendly lactate measurements, and they are on their way, but they're not here now, we still need to use the next best thing, which is heart rate, hopefully measured at the heart, like with a Polar H10, and a realistic measure of work output like speed or power. That's the best we have. In time, we will be able to have real-time lactate measurements, but we're just not there yet. When it is, we can revisit that conversation. And what the person who's asking that question is getting at is that we talk about heart rate zones and power zones, but what we're really talking about is what metabolism is doing. And that's the exciting part. So when we talk about zone 2, what we really mean is keeping lactate under 2 millimolars per liter. And then when it sharply rises and it's between 3 and 4 millimolars, then you get another sharp inflection. And physiologists can measure this with a lactate test in a stage test. I've got a lactometer on my stationary bike in my home gym. I like doing this stuff. Anyone who comes around to my house, I'm going to prick their finger or their ear while they're exercising to work out what's happening. So it is fun to do, but it's just not prime time. But that's what you're getting at, and we're certainly heading towards that in precision training in the future.
The next question's quite a long one, so bear with me. If the understanding is truly changing around this, then the counterfactual needs to be explained. The top cyclists in the world fuel their zone 2 rides with 60 to 120 grams of carbs per hour, despite having the best fat burning capacity on the planet.
I'm going to jump in. That's not true. The best endurance fat burning are those people on low carb ketogenic diets. And that has been shown the highest reported from Louise Burke's race walker studies, which have exceeded 1 and sometimes 2 grams of fat per minute. When we look at Asker Yerkendrop's work that has looked at the world's best cyclists and fat burning capacity, they're more like 0.4 to 0.6 grams per minute. So each times when we look at these concepts of who's got the best fat burning capacity, it's those that deliberately train on lower carbohydrate diets. Now, I'm agnostic when it comes to carbohydrate and fat in the diet, and so is Paul. What Paul is talking about is the smart choice and not blanket adopting, and also understanding the difference between what world tour cyclists or also what ultra marathon runners like David Roche are doing, where they're really pushing that carb concentration, versus somebody training 30 or 60 minutes, 3 days per week, and looking at pushing metabolic flexibility in different directions. So let's put in one box the conversation about elite athletes. We're not talking about that in this conversation on this podcast whatsoever. And then let's talk about what the general public need to do to promote metabolic flexibility. And no one is really earning the right to be pushing 120 grams of carbs an hour if you're training cardio an hour a week.
Okay, and just to finish that question off, because there's a little bit more that you might want to speak to. It goes on to say you don't use zero carbs during zone 2 exercise at all. The training itself is what makes your fat oxidation high under load. And also the idea that you have a huge insulin response when consuming carbs during or around exercise isn't true. Muscle contractions facilitate insulin independent glucose disposal.
Yeah, both of those facts are also not true. Yes, of course, you're not burning zero carbs in zone 2. No one is saying that, so we can probably just leave that aside. The whole point about zone 2 training is that it's contained, all the energetics are contained in the mitochondria, and it's burning a nice amount of fat. It kind of corresponds with fat max, and it's also burning carbohydrates. So it's a beautiful intensity zone to push the flux of both fat and carb burning, but without penalty to recovery. So you can accumulate a lot of exercise, but not worry about it affecting other sessions in the week. So that's why endurance athletes tend to favor that. But the idea that there's no insulin being released when you have carbs around training is absolutely not true. Just look at the insulin responses when they do graded carbohydrate. So yes, it's less. We all know it's less, and we all understand the insulin-mediated and non-insulin-mediated glucose uptake via the contractile components of muscle. I was around when that was invented, but you still get an insulin response. And the more your carb intake goes up, the more the insulin response. Just have a look at those studies where they measure insulin while feeding carbs during endurance exercises. I thought it was zero as well until I looked at that, and that is absolutely not true.
Any final words on the conversation with Paul before we move to Professor Stu Phillips?
Paul is an outstanding coach. He doesn't just train weekend warriors. He's trained people who are multiple gold medalists, world championships across multiple Olympic games. When an individual like that, who is an expert in interval training and in athletic development and in coaching, talks about different approaches for carb intakes and the place for fasted training, low carb training, and the place for carbs, he has an open option for athletes depending on who they are. So he tests them to work out, you're carb sensitive, you need more carbs during training. We're going to push that into your overall training plan. And then there's those that are insulin resistant. And in a recent study from Print showed that 40% of the male subjects were insulin resistant when they're on the high carb diet, which was reversed when they went low carb. So I'm that candidate. I'm insulin resistant when I push the carbs that amount. So Paul would say, well, let's experiment with going slightly lower for you, and we can monitor your performance, monitor your metrics, and see if that's improving for you. So we've got multiple options, and I would just say be wary of applying what the world's best are doing, like a Tadej Pogačar, and say, I'm going to do 180 grams of carbs an hour. Well, when you are doing zone 2 at 4-5 watts per kilogram of body mass for 5 hours at a time, maybe you have earned the right to have that amount of carbs.
Thank you so much. And now we shall move into the questions for how to build and maintain muscle through menopause with Professor Stuart Phillips. So the first question comes with a thank you. I appreciate this so much. I'm wondering if you can bring someone else onto the podcast that talks about fascia, health, and exercise. Fascia work is gaining interest now in the mainstream, but it is too slow.
Absolutely, yes. I want to have special topics. Somebody has also asked about blood flow restriction. I will bring on a blood flow restriction expert, and I'll bring on a fascial expert. We use both these tools, and the fascial understanding is growing. I've gone both ways, and I'm now a real fence sitter when it comes to it, because when I consider the word myofascial, we often think that you can separate fascia from muscle, but they are absolutely interjoined. In my office behind me, I have got all of the world congresses on fascia, which I couldn't make in person, but I have the proceedings sitting next to me. So I've been avidly following the fascial world to see what can I take from it to add and better improve my own training systems. and I will go into that discussion with whoever I get at that time for fascia. So thanks for that feedback.
The next question, Tony, is, again, with a thank you. Great interview. There is so much clickbaiting around menopause. It's really nice to have some hardcore data presented. I would love to know more about some of the information around fasting and menopause, as well as protein timing. I have read that women need to get their protein in within half an hour of exercising, and I'm just not sure if that is true, or you have to just get in your daily requirement.
Yeah. When you look at, again, the totality of the research that has been done, both directly looking at protein and muscle in that population group, but then also as an aside, when a study was designed to look at the role of intermittent fasting with or without exercise, where they're exercising in the fasted state and they're not eating for a few hours, but then getting their calories later in the day or earlier in the day, depending on how the model is, you need to read across the literature to come to a conclusion. Now, the argument that females need protein immediately afterwards, whereas men can delay it, is based on estrogen. And when you look at the rise and fall of hormones and the role of estrogen in triggering muscle protein synthesis, we actually see that that's not a strong argument, or it's not held by experts in the field of protein metabolism and muscle mass. Because females have been, and this literature goes back to the 1990s, before they did traces, before they did muscle biopsies, they were just looking at nitrogen balance. So this study goes back decades, that when males and females are fed the same amount of protein at different time points compared to in the day, the response is the same. So it doesn't seem to be that estrogen is playing a role in this remodeling of muscle tissue. And that goes premenopause, but it also goes postmenopause. And again, why would it make a difference? If estrogen is not triggering muscle protein synthesis, then its timing doesn't seem to be very important. And we compare this to studies which look at just getting the total amount of protein in the day versus spacing it throughout the day, which is essentially what that argument is saying. And there seems to be a consensus that as long as you get your total day's protein, regardless of how you get it, but you hit that number every 24 hours, that seems to be the most important. Now, that is such a good message, because sometimes we get derailed and you train and then get on a phone call, or your kids are pulling you in this direction, you get stuck in traffic and you can't have your protein. Don't stress. Don't let it raise your cortisol, because as long as you hit your protein in the day, that's what matters. Protein just before and after for a female, the data is not there. It's based on either acute estrogen studies, not good enough. It's also based on my studies, also not good enough.
And the next question for you, Tony, is if lighter and more leads to the same degree of fatigue, why not do it all the time? Why do you need to do light and heavy rather than just one?
You don't need to. You can pick whatever rep range you like doing and doing it. But a good coach would say, don't forget about variety. Variety seems to be important. It might be overrated with varying exercises and rep ranges, but variety does seem to play an important part in triggering new adaptation or pushing you past plateaus. Historically, rep ranges would vary. And the reason for this originally was thought because you tap into different motor unit pools and different quantities of tissue. And that's still held by experts in muscle physiology in some circles. In Stu Phillips' circles, who's gone and measured motor units, who would say you still hit your fast twitch fibers, which is what you want, but you get to them in a slightly different way. And therefore you can choose. So if you don't like the psychology of lifting heavier loads, say in the 3 to 6 rep range, and you prefer for joint or for safety doing 10 to 15 to 20, then you can choose. So there is no extra benefit of going that heavier if you prefer lighter. But I would say, with my coach's hat on, I would periodize, which is a fancy way for saying progressing, I would undulate it and do some in that 10 to 20 rep range, and then a few programs in the 5 to 10 rep range, just to make sure we are hitting every different physiological pathway.
Thank you so much. And now we'll move to a question about testosterone production. So what about testosterone production relative to resistance training, again, in postmenopausal women?
testosterone slowly declines for males and females from peaking at around 25 to 30 years old. It doesn't go off a big decline around menopause. So it just keeps dropping down. Resistance training causes a blip in testosterone for about 20 to 30 minutes. It goes up and then it goes down. And by the way, so too does cortisol and growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor. They go up and then they go down. Intensive research has tried to work out why they're doing this, but it doesn't seem to be triggering muscle protein synthesis, muscle growth. It's doing something, but we're not quite sure what that is. And not for lack of trying. This has been, ever since they got an assay for testosterone, they have been measuring testosterone response to exercise. So it's really well studied, but it's not really clear what it's doing. There are theories about this, but generally speaking, the testosterone that will blip after your weight training post-menopause, it is there, but we don't quite know what it's doing currently.
And that wraps up the questions for Professor Stu Phillips. We will now move into questions for Louise Burke. Fueling female performance, the truth about carbs, collagen, and fasted training. So the first question for you, Tony, we've got from a 59-year-old female. She says, I took up rowing in the past few years and I love the camaraderie, competitiveness, and intensity. Year over year, my erg times keep improving as my technique improves. I'm in Florida, so we are in the water 2 to 3 times a week all year round, plus erg sessions and land workouts. My body has changed dramatically. I'm gaining muscle for sure, but I'm also gaining fat. I'm stronger, just bigger. Do you have any advice for someone like me to be more lean?
Don't guess, test. If you are training that amount and you're noticing changes in body composition, get a DEXA scan to measure what your muscle and fat mass is as a benchmark, and then have that predict what, based on your fat-free mass, what your metabolic rate is, what your energy expenditure is. Then also in the same lab, exercise physiology lab, in the morning, measure your resting metabolic rate and compare them. They should be very, very close. Because if you are noticing your body composition is changing and you're not in your 70s, and that's when we start to see a decline in resting metabolic rate, then chances are you are eating more than your requirements. But how do you know what your requirements are? And it is really worth knowing what you're running on. So measure the energy expenditures of your session. Heart rate monitor will be good enough. And measure your resting metabolic rate with indirect calorimetry at an exercise phys lab. And then work out what you're eating. So it's going to require a bit of work. But if you really are interested, don't leave it to guesswork and go, this has happened to me. Why has it happened? You've got the tools in this day and age to go and measure DEXA, resting metabolic rate, measure your output of your sessions, and then measure your intake of food. Do it for a week and then work out where you're spending that energy in your intake that you didn't quite account for. And that will help you keep your muscle, but bring your fat mass down to a level that you're happy with.
Now, the next 2 questions are for the next podcast, which is with Professor Tommy Lundberg. How to build muscle and strength at any age, the real science of resistance training. The first one, what we say on Chris Beardley's new research that says if you don't hit a muscle every 48 hours, it's basically atrophying and we're just spinning our wheels.
I like Chris. I think he is a great functioning intellectual trying to solve the problems that we have in resistance training program design using state-of-the-art multidisciplinary research. Hats off to the amount of reading that goes into his research reviews and his output and his podcast. Fabulous stuff. The issue with looking at the rate of atrophy, a lot of it comes from detraining studies or limb immobilization studies. When we look at the research looking at 1 day per week versus 2 days per week versus 3 days per week versus muscles, there seems to be a trend to push for an optimal frequency around twice per week. That disagrees with what Chris is finding from detraining studies. Now, I'm sorry, this is slightly technical, but essentially what they're saying is once you exercise a muscle, it starts muscle protein synthesis and then it comes back down to zero, and it's basically down to zero in about 48 hours. Therefore, you need to start training that muscle again, otherwise you go into atrophy. And I try and take that literature, which is really clear literature, and compare it to studies where they've done twice per week and still gain muscle mass. Now, I'm sure Chris would say I'm not saying it's ineffective, so he wouldn't use the word spinning your wheels. He would say the ideal way is to hit a muscle every other day. And I like that because he may well be right, because we do need data. The question is, could you train upper body, lower body, lower body, and hit it with the same volume and get the same results? He would argue, no, that's not the case. We don't have really good data to compare it. So at this stage, you've got options, but I think where everyone agrees is that once a week, like a bro split, chest and tries one day, like my 15-year-old son is always asking me to do, chest and tries, back and bis and legs, that's probably not ideal, not worthless, not ideal, because there's not enough frequency for the muscle. So I think I land around that 2 days per week, and that seems to be the best balance. If more data comes out, we will change our mind, but I do love Chris's work.
And the last question for Professor Tommy Lundberg's episode is around anti-inflammatories. So is it only anti-inflammatories that stifle muscle gains, or does Panadol do the same?
Panadol does not. In fact, Panadol is a well-known, not that I'm going to say this publicly, it's a well-known ergogenic aid. It helps you exercise in the heat, and it helps you blunt perception of effort like caffeine does, and is routinely used in sports to squeeze a little bit extra. Now, no one recommends that you actually do that, but that has been studied, and that is sometimes used in high-level performance. Anti-inflammatory is the opposite. It blunts the adaptation, and so too do antihistamines. H1, H2 antihistamines will also block adaptation. We stay away from anti-inflammatories around the training window, but Panadol seems to be fine. But please don't do it as an ergogenic aid. It's interesting, but it's not for public use.
Now we're going to move into one that has a few more questions, which is your podcast with Professor Scott Trapp. First question is from a 47-year-old, has been doing sports for 30 years. So 47-year-old here, I've been doing intense sport for 30 years and love most training sessions. One thing I missed in this conversation is the benefit of doing gymnastics. Functional fitness incorporates that element too. Gymnastics may not be as critical for longer life compared to weightlifting and cardio, but I do expect it to help with the quality of life, as simple things like bending over to pick something up will be easier if one is flexible and agile. That said, I find stretching to be a little bit boring, thus don't do enough of it. Personally, I simply enjoy the gymnastics exercises, and learning new skills keeps me motivated.
3 comments. Completely agree. And although gymnastics is not for everyone, from an injury history, rotator cuff tear, low back issues, and so forth, but the proof of principle is learning new skills is strongly associated with positive cognitive outcomes. So we love that. So point number 1 is absolutely, completely agree. And you're right. There is this hierarchy, isn't there, that we want high levels of strength and power and VO2 max. So how do we get that? We do the exercise that improves strength, power, and VO2 max, which happens to be aerobic training and resistance training. But what about other skills-based activities like gymnastics? Completely agree, all things being equal. But don't forget, so too dancing, so too learning a musical instrument, so too learning all different aspects of things that are completely foreign to you. My dad, who's 80, said, I was thinking about going back to university and doing mathematics. I like mathematics, something completely different. He's a chemist. For me, don't tell anyone, but I want to learn to dance because I can't dance. So it would be something completely new. Cognition and physical performance is about doing skills that are completely foreign to you, and dancing is one of those things. So I completely agree with all of those aspects.
Well, the next question is I think, in the same vein, which is I'm 76 years old. And how does Tai Chi fit into the equation of fitness? By the way, I've loved the 2 podcasts that I've watched so far.
Great, thank you. Tai Chi, it falls under the musts, which are resistance training and aerobic training. And then under that, we come the new skills development, movement, breath awareness. Tai Chi fits into that. Mobility in any way you like it, whether it's yoga, gymnastics, dedicated mobility drills, stretch classes. That helps you do weight training, right? It helps your joints when you do the running or the cycling. So a lot of these things, although they're second tier, they actually enhance your ability to do the top tier stuff. So yes, Tai Chi, dancing, yoga, Pilates, that's all second tier work. And that's not to say it's lesser, but in terms of when you're time crunched, because almost everyone says, where do you want me to find the time for all this? Make sure you hit the big rocks: weight training, strength power, aerobic training.
I think the tier 1, tier 2 approach is very helpful and practical for people to understand.
That's called the Bataille tiered system, by the way. I'm joking. I never name things after yourself.
That's a topic for another podcast.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, next question, still for Professor Scott Trappy podcast. Thank you. Great informative interview. I am 86. I am a sportsman, not a professional, but an open water swimmer all year round, 30 kilometers per month, cycling about 100 kilometers, and of course, strength training a couple of times a week.
Wow. 86. Wow.
Phenomenal. One issue that you only hinted at: excessive loads destroy muscles. How to understand what markers exist in order not to go beyond the red line. Garmin watches, unfortunately, after my 1.5 to 2 kilometer swim, 2 minutes, 100 meter on average, suggests 3 days of rest. The same after a 20 kilometer bike ride. It seems to me that these are false recommendations. What do you advise?
You are quite astute and correct. They are false recommendations. You can happily ignore the input, as well-intentioned as they are. The wearables are trying to triangulate a whole bunch of different things, from resting heart rate to your previous strain of exercise to your heart rate variability, and they come out with this formula of your strain and how much rest you need. They're all rubbish. All rubbish. You can happily dispense with them. I would not worry about the load of training and muscle deterioration. It's all about your ability to recuperate. The simple take-home test is, do you need rest because your performance is declining? 1 or 2 days off will do that, because it stops you entering an overtraining syndrome. If you are exercising and your performance are for multiple days inexplicably dropping, you're swimming slower, you're riding less, you're sore, you don't feel like exercising, you're starting to push into overreaching. Take 2 days rest, then come back again. That's the best way of doing it.
Okay, next, what if I am 66 years old? Any specific ways of measuring health, wellness, anti-aging, and muscle development?
So we look across a number of buckets where we want to invest our time. We've got muscle and bone, and we need a DEXA scan for that. Then we look at metabolic health, and we can use fasting glucose tests and insulin tests. But even better, having a once-a-year oral glucose tolerance test, OGTT, with insulin to see how well you dispose of your glucose levels with insulin. So with those two, and then potentially having just poo-pooed wearables to look at sleep, because if you are comparing at least apples with apples, like an Oura ring or a Whoop strap or a Garmin watch, no affiliation with any of them. I use Oura, again, no affiliation. I can compare every night. Now, of course, they're not perfect, but they're giving you this idea of trying to get an hour of deep, hour and a half of REM, minimal wake-ups, and then you can really clean up sleep hygiene and focus on those, as we say, these big rocks, so that you can come back and lift weights, do your cardio, eat a healthy diet to support all of those things. Bone and muscle, your blood work to look at metabolic health, and great sleep. And that's probably, other than diving deep into your bloods and looking at mineral status and vitamin D and some lipid markers, which I'm sure your primary care physician would be on, you're probably looking at those.
Second last for Professor Scott Traffy.
Can I just add one more thing? So
Absolutely.
sorry. Also, don't forget to measure what we're interested in, which is strength, like on a leg press, on a lat pull down and a chest press, a lower body, upper body, push pull, and whatever cardio mode you do. Is it biking? Is it rowing? Is it running? And let's measure like your best 5-minute effort. Those numbers want to be staying the same or getting better. Okay.
Perfect. Nice practical approach as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is around the word trained or untrained. So it's just a request for further definition.
Yeah. And we actually got a number of comments to please help us with the definitions. And so trained means more than 6 months training experience. And untrained means never trained before, but every one of us who's a coach you could have up to 6 months. We'll still call you untrained. You're still finding your way around the weights room and so forth. So scientifically, untrained is never like sedentary, not involved in regular exercise. So once off here and there, you're still untrained. I think it's really easy to say, even if you are engaging in regular exercise, it has to be up to 6 months. And after 6 months of regular training, we call that being trained.
One final question. Please talk about people who are studying standing on a vibrator.
Okay. And this question came in because the next podcast, we actually cover vibration training. Vibration training, whole body vibration training. And I talk about in the podcast with Maria that where I was teaching exercise physiology, we had vibration units one day and then I came in the next and they were gone. And that's because Maria was collaborating with two of the researchers in my department and they commandeered our vibration units. So they disappeared for that study. When you look at the data on whole body vibration training, there seems to be a benefit for muscle and bone. But what Maria said, and I completely missed this, is she said that often what you're seeing is muscle contraction during the vibration. So in other words, they have a bend in the knee, so their quads are engaging. So it's like a semi-squat when they're standing on it. She said you can't distinguish between whole body vibration by itself and the muscle activity going on it. And that needs to be included when trying to understand this literature. So that to me opened up a big can of worms because vibration training seems to be the real deal. And she was indicating it's probably because they're engaging muscle while they're doing it. So what does that mean for us who use vibration units? Or we bought one when we were awake at 3 a.m. in the morning and there was an infomercial on for one of these things and we thought, I've got to get one of them, is that when you are on them, you've got to bend the knees. You've got to engage the muscle when you are on them.
And speaking of Professor Fiatarone, that is the next one, which I think we have somewhere in the ballpark of 25 questions.
Mm-hmm.
So
and I think some of them are really similar. So we'll try and move through these super quick. In fact, may I just give a quick preamble, is that we had a number of questions on exercise technique and how to do the exercises. And we take everyone's feedback. But it would be so much more helpful if we could see these things. Completely agree. And Maria has provided 2 links that we're going to share that shows the exercises and the kinds of loads that are lifted. So, Kat, remove those questions. We will link that to you. The second question was on protein amount. And her point is that when you lift weights, you actually become more protein efficient. So you need more protein when you're not exercising. And we're going to link to those 2 studies by Campbell et al. And Morton et al. And you can go and read that data. And it comes from actually a well-known concept in muscle physiology is that when you start lifting weights, your body becomes better at using the proteins that you're having. So your protein requirement reduces purely because you become more anabolically sensitive. When you don't lift, you need more protein to turn on those anabolic pathways. That's essentially what she's saying. That is not contentious at all. And that's different to protein requirements for optimal muscle mass, which seem to land about 1.6 grams per kilogram of body mass, give or take. What throws the spanner into the works is what's your energy status, because that's for people who are in energy balance. If you're in energy deficit and you're lifting weights, Stu has found that you probably need a little bit more, maybe 2 grams per kilogram of body mass, but it's going to be in that ballpark, isn't it? It's going to be 1.6 to maybe 2 grams per kilo, depending whether you're dieting or not. But the point Maria was saying is that when you lift weights, you become more sensitive at using the protein that you're having. So, Kat, maybe let's cut those ones out, and we'll link the Morton and the Campbell paper and all those videos that Maria has given us for the exercises.
We did have a number of questions about both
yeah.
of those. Okay, so then that takes us to a different first question, which is, although this is inspiring, I need a repeat of this interview with more explanation for the successful high-intensity resistance training techniques.
Yeah. Okay, well, the high intensity was first proposed in 1940 by Thomas DeLorme. And what he said, after experimenting with a lot of different protocols, is that once you establish your best one rep, you do 80% of that, which is about 8 to 10 repetitions. And that has been tested and tested and tested for decades. And that's what Maria is using, is the DeLorme and Watkins protocol of 3 sets of 8 or 8 to 10 at 80% of your best repetition. She talks about how she does it. She gets approximate close to her one rep best, give or take, and then does 80% of that. That's what she's using. So when she talks about high intensity resistance training, that's what she means.
Okay, the next question. I would love to hear if the good doctor has an opinion on rebounding in older people for building muscle and bone.
It would be your excellent entry level into movement and to jumping. But from after, I'm going to say, an arbitrary 3 months, you will need something that impacts your bone and muscle a little bit more intensely and also more specifically. So works on like a sit to stand squat pattern, like a leg press or a squat. Then we know you're directly affecting lumbar spine, hip and femur, and the muscles involved in that extension movement to go from a sit to a stand. So rebounding is a really great entry level, but I would try and get off that in due course. And I think, again, an arbitrary 3 months is probably a good time.
The next one, Tony, this information is very encouraging for older ones still wanting to build muscle and strength. Please find someone to interview who has experience with training older ones using blood flow restriction training. It seems that the buildup of the metabolites with lighter weight would be very beneficial for older ones.
Yeah.
I found it very beneficial at 71 years old.
Yeah. Absolutely. I have used blood flow restriction for decades. I actually have an article about blood flow restriction training and its history on my webpage, I think tonybataji.com, and just Google my name and blood flow restriction and it will come up. I've been using it for decades. I love it where populations can't lift heavier loads. They can use body weight. They've got orthopedic injuries. And the only thing to consider is that it's not very pleasant. If doing it well and you're using maybe 70% of occlusion pressure, it's not really fun. So it's not for everyone, but it certainly is a tool I use in my toolbox. So I already know who I'm going to reach out to talk about blood flow restriction.
Okay, the next one's quite a long question, but, well, it's quite a long comment. I think I will get directly to the question for you, though, which is, do you have a network of students doing what you do in various locations around the world, particularly the US?
Yeah, thank you. I am asked weekly for training suggestions, and the issue is it's this quality control. It's very easy to become a personal trainer with a certification course. What is not easy is to have 10, 20, 30 years of experience across a wide variety of people who've got all sorts of orthopedic or health issues and performance goals, who also has a real desire to learn and do course after course after course. So we do get people from around the world doing my courses, but I don't know what they're like in the weights room at all. So I don't have a good answer for you. I apologize. But I think looking for certifications who've done the personal trainer course with the American College of Sports Medicine or the National Strength and Conditioning Association or NASM, the National Academy of Sports Medicine, looking for those acronyms are probably, you're going to push the likelihood of getting a better, more qualified trainer.
Okay, another absolutely fabulous, informative interview. Thank you, Dr. Bataji. Again, like we have had a few questions around the more technical words for the uninitiated.
Yeah, so knee osteoarthritis, knee OA, and that's been raised by a number of people. Great point. I will do a much better job at explaining the acronyms because I think somebody said I couldn't take anything from that podcast because it was just too technical. And I really take that to heart because this is for the public. This isn't for exercise professionals, for people who are scientists. They know this stuff already. So my job is to explain what they know into the real world and into the gym across the age and different gender sexes. And if I'm getting feedback such as I can't take anything because it's too technical, I will really take that to heart and explain those. So a lot of people ask what knee OA was. Knee osteoarthritis.
We did get a question. Obviously, you're running the menopause course, which is spoken about in the show notes. We did have someone who is 81 and is looking for some education at a course.
You know what? I think that has pushed me over the edge to how many courses do we run? And I think I could easily do a 2-part course on training the older individual, designed for an older individual to understand sets, reps, exercises, intensity, frequency, understanding pain, failure, working with effort. I think we could do that because we've got wonderful position stands. People like Maria have written these. A scholar I interviewed this morning, William Kramer, has also got position stands on training the older individual. And you're not going to go and read those. That's for people like me to do. So I think I will do that and put together probably a 2-part course. And you heard it here. So now I'm putting it out there. We'll try and get that out early next year.
All right. We've got a couple more questions, one of which was, I think you spoke to a little bit earlier, but we'll touch on it again just to make sure. Question around the studies early on. Were those earlier studies done in both men and women?
Yes.
Perfect. When is her new book coming out? I would like to be on the list to be notified.
Yeah, I would email her directly, and somebody else noticed the price of one of the old books. Yeah, she does have when books come into printing and they're more academically based, buy them straight away. Now, look behind me. I know this because when I think, oh, I missed that book, I want to go and I did this yesterday. I missed a book by William Kramer. So I had to go to a used book site somewhere in America. I'm in Australia and I had to buy this for an exorbitant price because I thought I could say, I have every book that you've written. And I realized I missed one. So I went and bought it. And it's like the price of my car, but I have to have it. So buy a book straight away. So when you see this price, $250, that's because it's an old book and it's out of print and people know that, so they price it like gold. I don't know when the new book is coming out, but I know she's working on it. I think it's something about nutrition and exercise. Email her. She's a delight. She will get back to you.
The next question, Tony, is how do I build muscle with sarcopenia?
Excellent question. I think we're going to, the course that we're going to build will be exactly for that. So sarcopenia just simply means the age-related loss of muscle tissue, which means that we apply the same progressive principles we do to anyone, because you can grow muscle at any age and any health condition. Now, how do we know this? Because in studies that give limb immobilization, so you get your leg or your arm in a cast for a period of time, the studies by ethics have to return the muscle to what it was before you got into the study, because they come out, they've got little T-Rex arms or little peg leg after this bed rest studies. And they have to ethically return the leg to the same state when they walked in. Now, sometimes that takes a period of time, but it gets back to where it was. Mm-hmm. So we follow the same progressive resistance training programs to build muscle that are mainstream advice: multiple sets, multiple exercises spread across the week. Typically, if you're new to exercise, 10 to 15 repetitions, leaving 2 or 3 reps in the tank from not being able to do it. And the more you've trained, you can start dropping under 10 repetitions. So think the rule of 3 sets, 3 times per week, up to 3 exercises for that muscle group where you're having muscle loss from.
That answers also the next question from a 79-year-old woman who was, again, also interested and worried about sarcopenia, which she believes she hasn't fallen and broken anything, but was wondering where to start. So I think we've addressed that one there as well.
Yeah, great.
The next one is approaching 80 and have been doing light resistance training for the last 20 years. I have sustained upper body muscle and tendon injuries that are either not healing, or if they are, it's taking many months. Should I continue to lift? And if so, what would be the best method to get back to where I was? I'd appreciate any suggestions. Thanks.
Yeah, great. We never stop lifting, full stop, because as soon as we stop, we start going backwards. The real concept to think about is working around injuries. And where you're able-bodied, you apply your normal progressive sets and reps and resistance training protocols, and we keep that forward trajectory. Where you're struggling with injuries, tears, tendinopathies, joint pain, and so forth, you apply special exercises, more physical therapy related. They could be with bands or with isometrics or eccentric. So very specific styles of training that you would get some input from a good physical therapist. And your program then has two components. It has your traditional resistance training, where you're able-bodied, and it has your physical therapy that's designed to get those tendons, muscles, ligaments back to where they need to be as well. Maybe the only difference could be in frequency. Sometimes with tendinopathies and muscle tears, you might give that more frequency in the week, whereas opposed to going for strength and muscle, you might do it only 3 days per week. So that's probably the only difference.
Okay, we've already covered the vibration plates.
Right.
So what is rotator cuff disease? What does that mean? Does that mean a tear?
Yeah, it typically means either a tendinopathy, which is the most common pathology is typically a frozen shoulder, and then a tendinopathy, which means that the beautiful collagenous fibers in the tendon, they become all granulated and dysfunctional. And then, of course, there's muscle tears, the rotator cuff tears themselves. It'll be one of those three areas, but that's why we're really mindful of posture. So if you have kyphosis, you're forward flexed, or you've got forward neck position, we really try and watch these overhead movements, pushing and pulling, in favor of horizontal pushing and pulling, because just the rotator cuff is just not there with the mechanics of the scapula, the shoulders, to move around safely, that we can cause more harm than good. And this might answer another question. What do you do if you're kyphotic? We work in a horizontal plane. We work our shoulders and chest in a horizontal push and in a horizontal pull rather than overhead. And yeah, is it perfect? No, of course, we'd love you to work overhead, but your shoulder position, your spine position might not allow that. With rotator cuff disease, it will require different interventions. So physical therapists would use special exercises at all different angles to work the rotator cuff, which is on the top, it's underneath, and it's behind us. Use a good physical therapist to help you through that, because that's some of the more common issues we see that could derail you. If you're going guns in to getting stronger and growing muscle as you get older, watch for the rotator cuff. So we do a lot of tendon resilience work for the rotator cuff in this population group.
The next question is actually about hip fracture. So by hip fracture, do you mean upper femur fracture?
It can be. So we have upper femur fracture, but we've also got pelvic fracture. So it depends where you are in the world, what language is being used. So we typically look at lumbar spine, pelvis, mid-femur, upper femur, or the neck of the femur or the trochanter of the femur.
All right. Last two questions for Professor Fiatarone before we move to the last podcast. And that is, are the cognitive training apps mentioned in this video available?
I believe they are, and that's a question for Maria because they've studied a number of different ones. And I also wasn't clear on exactly which one she was using. They are listed in the study, but she did mention that they're commercially available. So once you find out, let me know, because I would like to know as well.
And then the last question is, how come nursing homes don't have knowledge of this work?
Yeah, I think we both know the answer to that. I wish they did. I have seen all of my grandparents in nursing homes, and my parents are both in their 80s, heading in that direction. I hope they're not listening. So yes, I wish. And when I was younger, I was part of a group that went around to the nursing homes every week and played music and read with them and so forth. So I've got a lot of experience visiting nursing homes and seeing what goes on in there. And just listening to Maria gave me goosebumps because they just did leg extension with just a homemade device and improved their strength, their muscle mass, and their ability to go sit to standing. They got their dependence back again. And one of the guys was saying, I just want to go to the toilet by myself. So that if that doesn't give you goosebumps, nothing will. That's just great news. So yes, maybe we can all make the difference and bring this information to our local nursing homes.
The next and final podcast that we have questions for is the interval training, mitochondria, and glucose control for women's health with Professor Jenna Gillen. We have two questions. One is, does creatine improve mitochondrial function? I would guess so, as it increases ATP production.
We would all guess so. We need really rigorous studies, of which we don't have any. Now, I thought, because creatine is not my area, I did a quick up-to-date check as of several hours ago, and the proof of concept is there, but the last line in the review said, but we await robust clinical trials to prove this. So that shouldn't dissuade us from taking creatine. It seems to be a lot of upsides, very little downsides, very cheap. But does it improve mitochondrial function? We need really good, robust data on that.
The final question of today, does the mitochondrial function stay improved or superior if you have been doing intense endurance exercise for many years, but then take a break for a few months due to injury, for example? And how long does the improved function last?
Sadly, and I hate to say this, but we are as healthy and as good as our last session. Once the adaptation period wears off, there's a very short window of maintenance, and then we start declining. And we know this from both detraining studies, but also from bed rest studies. We've got a lot of immobilization studies and bed rest studies, but we've also just got training and then stop training to see the rate of detraining. We go backwards. Exercise is not a once-in-a-lifetime investment. It's an everyday investment, all things being equal, recovery day here and there. But the take-home message is we're as good and as healthy as our last session.
And I actually think you put a post out today about what happens when we stop exercising.
Right. Yeah. And that was from a 1993 study. This has been really well investigated over the years. And that public message is just, it's kind of not there, is it? Is that exercise is working acutely. When you contract muscle, it's doing something in that moment for the next 24, 48 hours. And then it stops, sadly.
Well, Tony, that is all of our questions so far. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, the work by Maria in particular, the amount of questions that stimulated, I was overwhelmed with how many people of all age groups can watch YouTube and absorb that information and then come with intelligent questions. So thank you. And I just say thanks to you for organizing all of this and working behind the scenes. And thank you to our great speakers who give up their time. None of the people I interview have the time to do this, but they donate their time to put the message out there. And they always say that, say, oh, yeah, happy to put the word out there, because the public don't know, by and large, who they are and what they're doing, but their message is so profoundly needed in our industry.
I could not agree more. And I know I said it earlier, but I will say it again. Thank you for being the bridge between those incredible people and the general public who need this information but don't have access to it otherwise.
Great. Okay, well, let's do another. Thank you. Let's do another one of these when we finish the current round, which will be in a few weeks.
Sounds great.
Okay,
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for tuning into the Stronger with Time podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing this. And if you're ready to go deeper, the 9-week Science of Thriving course is available now. The link is in the show notes.